Thank you all for being here. My name is Anna Josephson. I'm an associate professor at the University of Arizona, and I am going to be our moderator today for this fun and interesting session on feedback. I'm going to take a moment to introduce our three panelists and then have them introduce themselves, and then we'll dive in with our questions. If you have any questions at all, feel free to put them in the chat, and we have some time at the end of the session devoted for interaction and feedback with any queries you might have. And then in 1 hour from now, we do have a mentoring and mingle session at 11 my time in Arizona, for folks who might want to stay and engage a little bit more. But without further ado, I will introduce Eric and Christiane and Elena. I'll start with Eric because he's pinned right now, but Dr. Eric Edwards is an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on institutional and environmental economics, with work examining natural resources, water resources, environmental justice, and dynamic pricing, among other topics. His work brings rigorous quantitative methods to questions of policy at the intersection of environmental regulation and resource markets. Next, we have Elena Krasovskaia, who's a PhD candidate in the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University, and she's on the job market right now. She's an applied microeconomist with interest in food, behavioral, and experimental economics, as well as public policy. Her research focuses on barriers to food security in the United States with an emphasis on physical access to food. And last, we have Dr. Christiane Schroeter, who is a TEDx speaker, business and wellness coach, professor, and creator of Petite Practice, a framework for achieving lasting success through small, intentional steps. She hosts the top 1% globally ranked podcast, Healthy, Happy, Hustle, where she shares evidence-based tools for clarity, mindset, and sustainable growth. With a PhD in health economics and over 20 years experience in marketing and innovation, Christiane supports professionals in aligning their goals with their values to create results that last and businesses that feel deeply congruent. So thank you to the three of you for being part of our panel today. I want to give you each the opportunity to introduce yourselves as well, and maybe share just in a sentence or two why you're excited to talk about feedback. I'll go in reverse order. So Christiane, do you want to start?
Sure, I would be happy to get started. First of all, thank you so much, everybody, for showing up here. It's great to talk about this because whenever you get feedback, it's just the emotional reaction is just right there. And so what we're going to give you is a little toolkit so that you can pull that up to separate your emotions from your reactions. You have your response ready. And then, of course, we're always open for questions, or even after the session, reach out and let us know if there's anything that we can help you with, because certainly this is an important topic and we want to make you really ready for the job market or whatever you're doing right now to get those feedback reactions into place.
Yeah, thank you very much. Elena, what about you?
Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. And as Anna said, I'm a PhD candidate at Cornell, and so I'm very early in my academic journey, but hopefully I will have something helpful to contribute. I think as a junior scholar, we experience a lot of firsts on both given side of feedback and receiving feedback. So I'd be more than happy to talk about that if there are any questions on that, such as like receiving your first referee report or teaching evaluations, things like that. And one other thing I wanted to note, just as a side note, is that I think it's very important whenever you're receiving or giving feedback to learn to recognize and provide some positives, because they're always there, but because of our like human nature, the tendency is to always focus on negatives and only see the critique and negative sides. But it's very important to identify and note what's good about the work or the presentation or something like that.
Great, thank you. And Eric, what about you?
Great. Well, I'm as well happy to be here and contributing today. I've got my calendar up in the background, and literally the rest of my day are half-an-hour meetings with students, like 6 or 7 of them back to back to give advice. So I'm not just looking forward to, giving, providing what I do, but learning a little more um, about what other people think and what questions there are. Um, I've I've advised a lot of students in my career, so I'm just got tenure here at UC Davis, but this is my, I think, 12th year because I've been moving around. So I have PhD students at academic institutions, former PhD students at academic institutions, and then I run the graduate fellows program at the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman. So that's about 4 fellows, one of whom is on today. So I've talked with a lot of people in a lot of different settings and to give advice. And I think Elena's point just now about saying some nice stuff, that's taken me a long time to get down, and I still think I'm working on that. But yeah, looking forward to today.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I like the topic of feedback because I think we all give and receive it often without thinking. It's just part of our days. And so the opportunity to be more intentional, in particular with giving, but in also how we perceive it, I think is a great chance for all of us. So we're going to start with an opening question, and I'll let the 3 of you decide who would like to respond first. But our question is, what strategies do you have to keep feedback actionable? I am also happy to call on somebody to go first if you'd prefer. I'm going to ask Elena to go first, as she's the only one who I've rotated and not had her speak first. So,
All right, sure. Yeah, I think the first thing I want to mention is that I think as with the saying that we all know that you should treat others as you would like to be treated, I think it's very applicable to feedback. And in terms of strategies to keep your feedback actionable, I think the very good thing to think about is what kind of feedback would you like to receive that is actionable, and use it as like a guiding principle in given feedback that can be actionable. And few specific things that I believe can make feedback more actionable is one is make sure that your feedback is tied to a specific goal so that it's more, it can sound like a suggestion instead of just an evaluation. So for example, if the goal is to like improve the identification strategy, might not be very useful to just say that your strategy or your results are not convincing. It will be a lot better if we suggest a specific action, like you can do this or that to improve your identification strategy or presentation of your results. Another thing I think is useful is to think about a feedback as a triangle process. Sort of think about the big picture ideas and then the fine tuning or like the nitty gritty details. And this serves kind of like double purpose. First, it helps you and the person receiving feedback to know what to focus on first and how to structure the response. But also it helps to identify like the most important things and whether the those like nitty gritty fine tuning details even are even important, because the big picture ideas need to be addressed first. And the last thing I'm going to say, I think it's important to keep in mind when both giving and receiving feedback that feedback is just a feedback. It's your opinion. It's not a fixed instruction. So in giving feedback, you should not expect that the person receiving feedback is going to do exactly as you say. So that should not be an expectation, I think, when giving feedback. And then in receiving feedback, I think it's even more important to keep in mind that you don't necessarily have to do exactly as you are told. You can step back and think about different things, like whether you heard this before, maybe in a different format, whether you can act on it or not. And maybe you should solicit more feedback if you're not sure. But just keep in mind that although feedback might be useful and it can improve your work or your skills, you don't have to act on it like 100% as it's been told.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And discovering and thinking about feedback, taking what's useful to you and what maybe doesn't need to be done or can't be done right now, and putting that through your process as you do. Christiana, do you have any strategies to keep feedback actionable?
I actually like to break down feedback into like 3 or 4 things. And then later on, when I'm addressing my question, I'm going to do the same thing. Otherwise, sometimes the person that receives the feedback kind of digests information, and it makes it really hard for them then to break down the information into these actionable steps. So I'm very much into structure. I believe that if you say first, I think it would be improved, it could be this way. Second, it could be this way. Third, etc., so that you're really giving these steps, and that at the end the person can look at it and say, all right, there's this 4 different suggestions here. Which one do I want to get started with? And do I even like feel that they are feasible in any order? And that makes it a little bit more doable because it lines it out like a little bit more like a to-do list. And at the same time, what I also like to do, and I really want to emphasize that, is that you listen to the person and you say, so what I'm hearing is this. You kind of repeat back a little bit their point of view. I think that makes it really important because feedback is also about empathy. And sometimes when we give feedback, we don't even want to listen to the other person's point of view. So it is very much a two-way street. And when I give feedback, I actually always first check in and see how that person is doing before I immediately dump all my suggestions on somebody, because I think that's just a common courtesy that you kind of see where are they even coming from, what is their state of mind, are they even ready to receive feedback? Because guess what, it's not every day is a good feedback day. So if you can prevent it maybe on a day where you feel this is just not the right thing, then just use that common courtesy and just don't do that on that day. I think that is very important as well. We are all humans, and sometimes we just need to take a step back and we just need to pause. But I will talk more about that later as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really generous perspective too, and meeting someone where they are, both to make sure that they're ready to hear that feedback, but that they can process it in a way that's really useful. Eric, what about you? What feedback or what strategies do you have for keeping feedback actionable?
Yeah, I think, the discussion has been good so far. I think there's a lot of different contexts for which feedback is provided, right? So you could be giving a talk at a seminar, or even if you're a grad student at your, at a lab meeting, or, a lunch meeting or something like that. And so you could get offhand comments and feedback, and then all the way to, chatting with your dissertation advisor or a colleague or someone that you've, senior in the field, you've gone out and asked for feedback on a paper from. And I think Christiane's point about it being a two-way street, I was thinking of a similar framing, that feedback is often a discussion. Sometimes the discussion is just, I'm telling you something that I thought of in my head watching your seminar, but you're mostly giving your seminar to me and I'm just popping off with some comment. But sometimes the discussion is, ongoing feedback with, say, a graduate student. And there, what makes what makes it actionable is, building that discussion into something that moves forward. And I think the biggest frustration I typically have as a giver of advice in those settings is when the advice, you have an ongoing relationship and the advice isn't moving the project forward. So I think, in terms of giving advice, I think you want to keep it positive, keep it moving forward. provide it in the right chunk at the right time, right? You don't want to talk about, 10 other robustness checks you can do when the first regression isn't framed correctly, right? But for those of you who are, for those of us when we're receivers of advice, I think it's also like if you want the advice to keep coming, right, you have to take some action on the advice also. So in terms of keeping advice actionable, like you have to sort of take some action as well. And I think the point raised about clarifying questions, like if you can't take action. So one of the things we implemented with our summer program to encourage actionable rather than at seminars, actionable advice. So the students give a couple seminars, is we start them off with let's wrap, for the second seminar, what have I accomplished since the last time I saw you? Right? And what advice did I get that I'm not going to incorporate or I think is beyond what I'm doing right now? And I think this is important both if you're giving repeated seminars, as a grad student, or if you're, early in your career and you're going back and asking people for advice multiple times, is saying, here's what I've done and here's what I'm not able to do. So I don't get the same basically unactionable advice again. Right. And I think this is often and a lot of times we'll go out and we'll see, oh, this is the fifth time I've seen this paper. They're making the same problem that I didn't like the first time. Right. Now that's their prerogative, right? But if it's an advice relationship, that gets frustrating. So that's what I think is it's this two-way relationship, and you need to build in strategies as a receiver of advice to be build in off ramps for unactionable advice or advice that is beyond where you're at.
Yeah, I think that's such a good idea of in giving feedback, also when you're receiving it, giving feedback about the feedback can lead to a more productive movement forward. And actually, I think a lot of what you said about venue and context segues us really well to our first individual question, which is for you, Eric, which is, what is the purview of giving feedback? And I think you touched on this a little, but I'd be keen to hear you more in depth. And Elena and Christiane, if you have anything to add, you can feel free to jump in after Eric.
This is a tricky question, and one that I'm excited to answer, but also have a little trepidation. So I think there's two sort of broad directions I want to take this. So first, right, feedback is context dependent, right? And receiving feedback is context dependent. If you're at a seminar and you're giving a job market talk, every single person's idea is the best idea you've ever heard, right? And it's great, and you're taking that feedback, and you might spend some time clarifying, right? But you're not really you're not in a discussion. You're in a position where you're taking the feedback. In other settings, right, you need to push back on the feedback that you're getting, and structure the direction of feedback you're getting. So I'm sort of thinking of, in this case, maybe an advisee-advisor relationship at sort of any level, but where there's kind of some repeated interaction and some power dynamic. And I think the advice I have in my career for providers of feedback, right, is the person who's coming to you for feedback is going to have topics and things they want feedback on. That's your first responsibility, is to provide feedback on that, meet them where they are and their demands. Then you're a professional, you have a lot of experience. There might be professional things that they need to know or need feedback on, but haven't asked for. And they might not have asked for it because it's too hard or they don't want to address it, or they may not have asked for it because they don't know. Now, as long as those are in kind of the professional realm and it's done with tact and sort of, I don't know, some empathy, I think that's definitely in the purview of feedback. Where I think things go off the rails sometimes is unsolicited feedback on other topics, especially personal topics. And so the reason I say trepidation is there are some circumstances and things I've been involved in my career, where you need to know as a person giving feedback, or someone will tell you very personal information that impacts professional outcomes. And here where I thought, and so, how do you handle that? Well, the person giving the feedback is gonna have to balance that. But I think the advice to the receivers of feedback, or the person soliciting feedback, right, is similar, but kind of the reverse. So the first is, don't try to limit the types of professional feedback that someone gives you. I often hear this, I really want feedback on my model, right? That's fine, but it's always good to say, but any ideas you have in general are useful, because the person may not know how to do your model. They might not know anything about the model, right? But they're an economist in the profession, and so they have ideas for how to make it something relevant to them. But then to kind of these other thornier issues, right? Always be strategic about what you share with the person you're trying to get advice from. Always be strategic, right? Think about the impression that you're giving to someone when you ask for a particular type of advice, or the way you ask for it. And think about what you want and how you want the relationship, how you want to shape the relationship, right? If you want an ongoing interaction, right? So on, be strategic. And then, and this is sort of my opinion, but I think it's your decision how personal you want to get with your discussions. But I like, and there's always going to be circumstances where you need to share personal information. But limit the personal discussions to the extent that the extent that that's worthwhile to you, right? To the extent that you think. There's no obligation to have, this sort of personal friendship relationship with someone who's giving you advice, and especially in kind of a setting where there's power dynamics, and in a setting like I'm often in, right? And probably in the profession generally, where there's a male advisor and a female advisee or something like that, right? But I think in general, right, the boundaries for the feedback, those are a mutual decision. And even as someone who's giving feedback, right, you have to understand where the boundaries are of the person you're giving feedback to, and what things they want and they don't want advice on, and topics they want and don't want to talk about, right? It might be that the person that you're giving advice to likes to talk about, their kids, right? Or something like that. And that's great, right? And over time, you'll build that personal relationship. It might be that the person you're giving advice to, they're married and they never mention their husband, and you think they might be getting divorced, or you think they might be, and you just have to leave that alone, right? And it's a mutual decision, and the person receiving advice has as much power in that mutual, what topics are discussed, as the person giving the advice. So that's sort of my view. And then I want to add the caveat, because I've sort of been thinking about this. There are a lot of circumstances, and as I'm thinking about this, I think of examples, right? Especially with unprofessional conduct from other people in the profession, where professional and personal sort of intersect in the advice that you're asked to give, right? Someone may be, abusive, or, not. Someone who works for someone, a former student of yours, might come to you and say, I have this issue or that issue with my new boss, or my new colleague, or something like that. That's where like this personal becomes professional. And I think it's really important that we understand that those things once they're in the workplace, they become professional advice. And like, it's not like, oh, that's your own personal business that X or Y is happening. So I think that my advice is in general, but there are very specific circumstances where personal things and things that we might think are out of the purview of advice suddenly come, roaring back. And I think it's just important that it's a mutual discussion, a mutual set of boundaries.
Yeah, I think that's really good and really important. And there's so much you said that I want to like comment on, but I won't say too much. I do really like your point about opening yourself to all feedback, but being able to give a little direction while still being available for all of it, and recognizing as a feedback giver and as a feedback receiver that you might not know exactly what you need and someone might not know what they need to hear. When I was on the job market, I remember getting a lot of feedback, and some of it I needed to lay aside and discard. But from my advisors in particular, there was a lot that I needed to know that I didn't even know how to ask. And so thinking about availability to that feedback, I think, is really essential. And it also turns us really well to our question to Elena, which is what kinds of feedback are most useful at different stages? And I'm sure as a job market candidate and someone finishing your dissertation, you are getting feedback at lots of different stages about lots of different questions. So I think you have a lot of interesting dynamics you can share with us here.
Yeah, sure. I hope so too. So kind of like the way I thought about it is more applicable to like the process of writing a paper or starting a project, but I think it's but more generally be applied to other processes that we are involved with, like teaching or something else. So I think in the early stages of, say, a project, the most useful feedback is feedback that is more conceptual and strategic. So would like to solicit feedback on the big picture stuff, whether our idea is good. And I think a lot of it is also about the resources, what kind of resources are available to us in terms of, for example, data or funding and things like that. And this, I think, affects a lot of who can give you the most valuable feedback. And in this stage, I think it's the feedback from like very senior colleagues who are experts in your field can be the most useful, because those will be the people who are most familiar with the literature and would have extensive knowledge about the resources that you can use. And so this is also when your project or idea is the most flexible. So any kind of feedback can be useful because you can shape what you're doing. There's a lot of flexibility in that sense. And you would like to know as much as possible early on to make sure you're headed in the right direction. And the more sort of middle stage, then, for example, you're working with your data or starting writing up, just starting your write-up, I think then the most useful feedback is more methodological and structural. So then you want to receive feedback on like all this nitty-gritty details about your analyses, or learn more about the data that you use and what else can you do. So some decisions are already made, so you want to kind of dive deeper and a little bit narrower, so that to focus on things that still can be changed. And talking about again, like who can provide the most useful feedback at this stage in the context of a paper, I think there it can people who are have a lot of knowledge about the methodology or the data that you're using can provide more valuable feedback. And they don't have to necessarily be very familiar with your specific area of research or the literature on that. But it's more about the technical details and things like that. And then you're getting closer to the final stages, when you're refining your draft, starting to present your work, even more decisions are already done. You know your results, you're decided what data set or what methods you're using. So the most useful feedback, I think, in this stage is about how you communicate what you've done and your results and how you frame it. So here it's more about clarity and the way you deliver your results. And I think in this stage, when you want to solicit feedback, it's useful to cast kind of like as broad of an call as possible, so you can solicit feedback from people from different disciplines at different stages of their careers to get as much feedback as possible to fine-tune your work. And there was other a little kind of follow-up question to this that I thought about is also something that Eric touched on a little bit, is whether it's ever okay to say that I'm not looking for this kind of feedback right now. And I thought about it in a way that there are sort of like two types of situations. And there are situations when the primary purpose of us presenting our work or exposing our work to other people is to solicit feedback. So the main purpose sometimes is to solicit feedback. And I think in these situations, you have sort of more control to like, what are you asking for? And it might be okay in this situation to say that. But there are other situations then the primary goal of us exposing our work is for our work to be evaluated. So for example, yeah, as I will soon present my job market paper, I don't think in that case I would be able, or I should say what kind of feedback I am or I'm not looking for, because I'm being evaluated of my work and my skills. And there are other situations like this. And the last thing I'm going to add about that is, I think, while I do think it might be okay to specify that you're not looking for certain types of feedback, in some cases, I think it will be it would be better if you find yourself in this situation when you are soliciting feedback, to say upfront right away, like before you start presenting, what kind of feedback you think would be most useful for you at these stages, so that your audience already knows what are you looking for, and this can help avoid sort of unsolicited feedback or feedback that you're either not looking for or you can't act upon for whatever reason.
Yeah, that's really good. I also, before we move to our last question and Christiana's response, I do want to draw folks' attention to the chat where we have a question that hopefully will kick off some of our discussion in a few minutes of how do you give and receive feedback, and what are some productive strategies for you. But we'll turn to Christiana now. And when we were brainstorming and talking about this session in our CWAE group, this was one that got written down a whole bunch of times. So I'm eager for your response. But what do you do when somebody cries? I know I'm a crier. I cry really easily and a lot. So I'm both giving and receiving feedback. So any response you have, we're grateful for. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. And actually volunteered for this question because, just as Anna said, I'm definitely a crier too. If you want to see me cry in action, there's even some YouTube videos. I think that some of my students filmed where I am crying tears of joy when I found out something. And so it is well documented that I do this, and I don't actually hold back at all. And I think it's important just to say this out loud. So let's maybe talk a little bit about this, crying. And I want to emphasize it's not always crying because of feedback that you necessarily gave. It could even be crying that somebody comes to you because of feedback they receive from somebody else. So they are essentially coming to your office, sitting down and starting to cry, because I experienced that a lot, to where students say, can I talk to you after class? And then they share something that they experienced in another setting with me, and they are essentially there just to use me as a listening board, right? It could also be, of course, that I receive feedback and I'm crying and I'm doing the same thing with somebody else. So here's my suggestion to you. You have to have those people at work, in your friendship circle, in your family, that could be your sounding board that you seek out when you feel like crying, because I cannot emphasize how important that is. So let's maybe get started. I have 4 points with that. First, If somebody comes to you and they are crying, my very first reaction is to pause. I have a Kleenex box on my table, right? And that's because I have allergies, but I also feel that it lets that person grab a Kleenex, make them feel comfortable, put back together. And it just creates a little bit of like a moment to where I'm just holding space. I am there, I'm listening, and I respect that they just need to cry, because we don't always need to immediately jump in and fix things. Sometimes it's just good to pause. So my first point is pause before you respond. Don't feel like you're a fixer, ask a whole bunch of questions. Just your presence is already super grounding. So pause, my first point. Secondly, when somebody comes to you and cries, to me, that's a data point. As an economist, I look at all data points as valid information. And crying just means that they are open to share something that they experienced, right? It's some signal that something really, really mattered. And now keep in mind, this could be also in their friends and family circle with somebody else. It doesn't even necessarily pertain to you, but to you, it's a huge sign of trust that they feel open enough to come to your office or wherever they meet you and actually start crying. So you have to be really calm. It's not drama. Tears are just data. That's how I look at that. So treat emotion really as information. That's my second point. So firstly, pause. Secondly, take it as an honor. Take it as, like an open door in responding to this correctly. And then thirdly, and this is the most important one, you have to separate the person from their performance. So it could be there is a student in your office and maybe they did poorly on some work, right? So instead of saying you didn't do this properly, just say this work looks like it was rushed and it was submitted really quickly, because you don't know what's going on in that person's life when they submitted it. To say you did this poorly and that is not a great way to give feedback. So you have to think, there's the work, there's the person. Those are two completely separate things. It's a human sitting in front of me and the work was turned in. It's not great quality, but I don't know what's going on with that person. That's maybe the why they're here. They're going to share that with me. So separate person from performance. And then lastly, and this is completely the most important one, you actually have to kind of normalize all this. You have to say, I can tell this is really important to you. Because somebody's crying in your office in a professional setting, you have to acknowledge that. You say, oh yeah, it means a lot to you. I get it. And I really respect that you're sharing this with me right now. Because alone that, all
Has she frozen for folks? Okay, phew.
me.
Christiane, you froze a bit. Would you be able to go back a little bit and share your fourth point again? I think we all lost you.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for bringing this up. I said the fourth point is normalize and center. So really acknowledging the emotion of the person, saying it means a lot to you, pausing, and then when you're ready, just use one clear takeaway and say something like, I really appreciate it. You shared this with me. I really appreciate that you came here, that we took the time to talk about this. So kind of build this balance of compassion and clarity, because it's trust. The person came to you, they trusted you with their emotion. And I think that's a very important thing, that you acknowledge that trust. And it's also important to kind of recenter, that they don't just storm out of your office, but that you actually leave it somewhat like we talked about this earlier with those action steps. And I love how Eric brought this together as well, that, sometimes you also need to think a little bit about the person as in a holistic setting. And Elena said that too. It's sometimes a first. Maybe they had never received feedback, right? I see this sometimes with freshmen when they come in. that it's just the first time when you actually give them feedback that's somewhat constructive and maybe looking at this in an academic setting. So yeah, let's maybe kind of like revisit this just in case the internet was a little wacko too. So the pause is important, looking at the emotion as being data, separate person from performance, and then lastly, just normalize and recenter so that you can move on and you're actually feeling you're on common ground before that person then moves on.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And I feel like we've all kind of brought together a similar set of topics, and we're sort of coalescing around a set of ideas. I wanted to share one of the responses in the chat from Osas Olrutumi, who said you should wait until you can deliver feedback kindly to do it. If writing feedback, delay sending it until you've done a tone review. I know this is really important for me. Feedback delivered poorly is less likely to be acted upon. Feedback should always address issues and not attack the person's intention or integrity. And I can say, having Osas as my colleague, and I'm very fortunate, and she gives excellent feedback. I'm glad to have you share that, Osas. Right now we're at quarter of, and so this is the point at which we would turn and give our audience the opportunity to ask questions. So I want to turn to those of you who are here. I do have a few that I want to ask also, but I want to turn it to our audience first and ask what questions you have or what pieces of feedback or giving and receiving you might want to share with us.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Of course, let's ask.
Okay, I was just wondering if there were norms, editorial norms guiding feedback in the profession, or do you know of any initiatives to develop them? Because I have received some editorial feedback or, reference review letters that were unprofessional. I didn't have the bandwidth to follow up just because I'm busy working on other projects, but I was just wondering if there were professional norms guiding our association that regarding that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'll turn it over to each of you. I'll say I once received some feedback from another economist on a project with all non-economists, and I kind of read the feedback. I felt like, oh, this is standard for economics. And my colleagues were horrified at the tone of it. So I do think that in econ, perhaps we have some tone considerations that other fields are a little more kindly in their tone. But I would turn it over to our three panelists. What do you think about norms for giving feedback, particularly in reviewer reports? And have you noticed anything about economics that might be different than other fields? Thanks, Osas, for your question.
So we have there's been problems with seminar culture. And I think actually the worst, nastiest referee reports I've gotten are from scientists. So I don't think the referee reports are that different across. When it's anonymous, but I think in the seminar culture, I think and when I went through, this was a number of years ago, right? We were training students to be a serious economist, you needed to kind of ask very harsh questions. And I think the advice of delivering harsh feedback kindly when you have harsh feedback, I think is becoming more the norm. And I think we're trying to train our students more. And I've certainly evolved in the way I interact with seminars. Maybe that's just getting older as well. Is like I think that is a disciplinary thing that we can move away from. Like you can deliver the same feedback without, and I think that the point in the chat, like questioning intention or integrity, I think is a big one, or even competence. I remember anecdotes of like, you don't even know what, I don't even think you know what this means, or saying something like that in a seminar. And it's unnecessary. You can just ask the thing. And I think that's evolving, but I think seminar wise, like it's way harsher. And maybe I'll just put a pin on a question I had about the crying. are there circumstances where we should try to avoid crying? And as a crier, Anna, maybe you can answer this. And then are there strategies for doing that? And maybe we can answer that question. But I think that falls in here because like people at seminar could be really mean to you and you could want to cry. Are there, and it's a problem with our culture, but also like it's something we have to deal with.
Yeah, I'll share that my crying problem comes when other people cry. So I remember another story, but when I was on the job market, I gave one of my seminars and had an engagement with faculty members afterward. And there was one person who asked a number of tough questions, I felt. And people in the department afterward came and apologized to me for that person's behavior and said that they weren't representative of the department nor their culture. And I hadn't clocked it as anything particularly intense at the time, which I found really interesting that it told me something good about the department, I felt. But I have no answers for anyone about crying in the moment because unfortunately that's not my impulse. I have an impulse if someone is receiving feedback and crying to join them in that, which is not great as a feedback giver. So it's something I'm working on definitely. Do other folks, I would not answer your question, but do other folks want to answer that question or answer the feedback question in general about referee reports or about seminar culture? That is like a in the moment feedback that we don't often have or other people don't have. My sister rarely has that in her real person job, that someone's giving her feedback on her work in that moment.
Yeah, I would be happy to talk about the seminar question. I think with regard to the in the moment questions, if it's really off topic or you feel they didn't really understand it, my best suggestion is just to smile it and say, oh, thank you. This is actually a really interesting point I hadn't thought about. And you don't need to address it in the moment. And I sometimes even feel that in job interviews that some people come in and they just want to test somebody and it seems like are we actually wanting to hire this person to be part of our team or what is this really now? And so I think that what you really need to consider in this moment is just pausing and how you respond. Look this up and let me get back to you, especially if you feel you're going to start crying. So that's my suggestion to you. And I feel that we sometimes feel we need to have answers for everything. And there's absolutely no need to. Actually saying that you don't know it, or even if you feel that person didn't understand it, like saying, oh, let me get back to you about this. And you can send them the paper and say, actually, I had pointed this out right here. That's totally all right. And I think it just makes that person still feel human. But at the same time, if you feel this is something emotional to you, it also allows you that space to gain your composure again.
Yeah, I think that's really being able to give yourself a moment to come back to where you want to be, and in both sides of it, I think is really great. Elena, do you have anything you want to add on this?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. I guess I don't have much to add about the norms. I think you can just do whatever you can on your side when you are given feedback. But in terms of receiving feedback, it's important to recognize what is and what isn't like in your control. So then we are at receiving feedback at a seminar. We have no control of what other people are going to say, how they're going to behave. So I think it's important to kind of be prepared to receive harsh feedback and have some kind of like template answers that you can give, such as, yeah, I'll think about it, or yeah, something along those lines. And also as a junior scholars, I think it's just a learning curve. Like the more feedback you receive, the better I think you'll get at recognizing what is constructive feedback and what's kind of outside of the norms, what recognizing why like some things that can be like really biased or just not coming from a good place and not relevant to what you're getting feedback on. It's sometimes hard, but that's something we, I think, have to deal with. And it's the more we practice recognizing the helpful and unhelpful feedback, the better we get at it.
Yeah, I also think of something you started with, which was like treat people how you want to be treated. And something I have found when writing referee reports lately is trying to turn it back and think, how would I feel if I got this? And that makes me just more cognizant of the tone that I'm using, but also I think more descriptive. If there's something I really feel that an author should do, I need to give them enough details, because there's hardly anything worse than someone saying, you have to do this, and then you being like, great, I don't understand what you're asking for. And so giving both kind feedback, but the actionable component of it also, and ensuring that you're giving the report you would want to get. Thank you all for that. I think we have time for another question. Is there another question in the audience? Thank you, SS, for that lovely one. Other questions out there?
I would like to ask how to handle situations when you receive feedback from your colleagues. As you enter the profession, you find yourself very frequently, in a position where your colleagues will attend your classes, will observe you in class, and they will provide feedback. They will write a letter for you. They will, you know, the process. And so sometimes that's very constructive and helpful. Sometimes I have find myself questioning the intention behind the comment, I must be honest. And so I would like to know what's your strategy, or if you have any strategy with respect to handling feedback from your colleagues. You know that you're going to evaluate you again next year and the year after, and how to keep a balance between not like recognizing what's useful, but also pushing back on the things that you believe do not represent accurately either your work or your intentions.
That's great. And I think one thing I didn't realize as a new faculty member was that the feedback are going to keep coming, and there's going to be maybe even more than when you were a job market candidate. So I love that question. Thank you, Tina. I know we have meetings that start at 10, but Christiane or Eric in particular, would you like to respond to this and how you give feedback to your colleagues? Christiane has to go to another meeting, but thank you for being here, Christiane. And if anyone has questions, she's offered to have you check in with her. So maybe I'll just ask Eric for how we can respond to our colleagues' feedback.
This is an amazing question.
Yeah, I think it's really good.
I hadn't even thought about this, but yes, depending on what type of institution you're at, right? Your colleagues might be commenting on your teaching, right? They might be giving you advice for how to get tenure. They might be giving you advice on where to send your papers to, what journals, whether you need more publications, whether you need higher quality publications, all these sorts of pieces of feedback. In terms of it's really important for departments to assign people to review classes who don't have ill intentions, right? And there's a lot of effort at every department I've been into, right, to get this person needs to have their class evaluated. Yes, we want constructive feedback, but this is for evaluation purposes, and we don't, unless there's a real problem, right? We don't want this letter to sound like this person is a bad teacher, because they're probably not. And in a lot of cases, they're very good. And so you need to writing a positive letter and finding the people who know how to write positive letters. I think it's actually harder within a department. When you go to external letters for tenure, the candidate themselves has a lot of say in who it goes out to, and then the department is usually very interested in getting the person tenure, so they go out to professional people. Within a department, there can be these fault lines that develop and these ideas of how things should be done. And I don't know how to answer that question. How would you do it? I think usually departments will ask, is this person okay to write a letter? I think it would probably be okay to think of some reason not related to them not liking you or being real negative or something like that. Like, oh, I prefer someone who is more did something in this field or something like that. If you know about it ahead of time, over time you'll understand who's going to write a harsh letter and who's not. And then I think it's our job as we become more senior to be like, okay, we have a junior faculty member. Let's have someone who gives constructive advice, but also writes a positive letter to help the person's career, not someone who's going to go in and sabotage things. And I think that's true of external letters too, right? We need to we want a good solid letter. We want to make sure we don't send it out to someone who's going to sabotage people. And I think this really, it's not something I've really discussed with internal letters, but it happens all the time, right? I mean, every single merit at UC Davis, we have, or every single big advancement, we have a ad hoc committee of a couple people write a letter. And so I think it's important, we have to understand the context of that. Like, this is a person's career. And I remember, and I know we're running out of time, but at NC State, we had a big discussion on whether those sorts of comments should be anonymous or not. Because they really affect people's career. Like, should you be allowed to give anonymous feedback that's going to prevent someone from getting tenure? So these are big questions. We were out of time, but
Yeah, man, that is such a good question. I wish we'd come up with that earlier. It's such a good one. Thank you everyone for being here. It's 1 minute of 11, so I will, well, in my time zone, sorry. I'm assuming you're all in Arizona with me, but thank you for being here. We hope you can stay for our mentorship mingle, which will go another 30 minutes. And please join us for our next webinar, which is on 3 December, another Wednesday. It's at noon Eastern, which is at the same time as this one. It's not who you know. Well, actually, it kind of is. A networking field guide for introverts, social scientists, and skeptics. That should be a really fun one. So I hope I will be able to see all of you there.